name is Bob Elmendorf. I'm a member of the steering committee. Upper Hudson Peace Action is a chapter of Peace Action New York State, which in turn is an affiliate of a nationwide organization, Peace Action, the largest grassroots peace group in the United States. Tonight, we are pleased to present a talk by Professor Larry Wittner entitled, How the Peace Movement Can Work More Effectively to End the War in Ukraine. Larry will speak for about 30 minutes, and then he will answer questions from the audience for the next 30 minutes or so. If you have a question for Larry, please place it in the chat and please keep it brief. The chat will be closed during Larry's talk, but will be open for your questions immediately after that. Janine Moon of Upper Hudson Peace Action Steering Committee will comb through the questions and select and consolidate some in abbreviated form for Larry to answer. We would appreciate it if folks do not use the chat for interpersonal conversations or for lengthy comments of your own, as wading through this is time consuming. Larry Wittner is Professor of History Emeritus at the State University of New York in Albany. Before that, he taught at Hampson Institute at Vassar College and at Columbia University, as well as at Japanese universities. He has written or edited 13 published books, as well as hundreds of articles, most of them on issues of peace, war, and international relations. Larry is a former president of the Peace History Society and an affiliate of the American Historical Association. He has received numerous awards for his scholarship and teaching. In addition, Larry is a longtime peace activist, having started that career in 1961 when he began demonstrating against nuclear weapons testing and has served as co-chair of the National Board of Peace Action. Larry is also a member of Upper Hudson Peace Action Steering Committee. And so I'm pleased to present to you Larry Wittner.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to all of you who are attending this event tonight. In the midst of a war-torn world, it's tempting to slip into escapism. So I salute you for the courage to confront some painful issues. Let me begin by making a very disturbing point. After more than 3 months of the Ukraine war, the largest, most destructive military conflict in Europe since World War II, the peace movement has had remarkably little impact upon it. Compared to peace movement campaigns in recent decades, for example, against the nuclear arms race, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the potential war with Iran, and Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, the peace movement has had very little effect upon public opinion, popular mobilization, or public policy when it comes to the war in Ukraine. The peace movement's ineffectiveness during the Ukraine war is particularly striking given the fact that in some ways this war should be a relatively easy one against which to organize. For example, the massive Russian military invasion of Ukraine is a clear violation of the UN Charter, a charter that constitutes international law and has been signed by all the war's participants. In Article 2, the charter says, quote, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Lest there be any doubt about the relevance of this statement to the Ukraine situation, the International Court of Justice ruled on March 16th that Russia must halt its military operations in Ukraine. After a UN Security Council resolution along these lines was vetoed by Russia, the UN General Assembly, by a vote of 141 countries to 5, passed a resolution demanding that Russia, quote, immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The only 5 countries that supported the Russian position were Russia, North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and Eritrea. Even some of Russia's closest friends, such as China and Cuba, abstained rather than back Russia's clear flouting of international law. Moreover, the Russian war in Ukraine is an imperialist war. This is an attack by one of the world's mightiest military powers upon a much smaller, weaker nation, with territorial goals that include seizing control of all or part of Ukraine and annexing it to the Russian Empire in some form or other. Just before the invasion, Vladimir Putin publicly proclaimed that Ukraine is, quote, Russian land. Given the war's imperialist nature, it's not surprising that it's not only been overwhelmingly condemned by the United Nations, but by public opinion and by human rights groups. The Russian government's justification for the Russian invasion, its justifications, are not persuasive. Although Vladimir Putin has complained about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, this action would have been perfectly legitimate, as the UN Charter, which does ban invasions of other nations, does not ban membership in military alliances. Russia, in fact, currently heads up the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a military alliance comprised of 6 nations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. One might also ask why Russian national security concerns are more valid than the national security concerns of nations on Russia's borders, particularly nations that in the past have been invaded and gobbled up as territory by Russia or its predecessor, the Soviet Union, and its predecessor, Russia. Furthermore, if a feared threat to national security provides valid grounds for military invasion, this would also justify past or future military attacks by the United States on Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Panama, and numerous other Caribbean and Central American nations. Furthermore, as a practical matter, before the Russian invasion occurred, Ukraine's joining NATO was not imminent, for several NATO nations opposed it. Indeed, in late March of this year, more than 2 months ago, Ukraine President Zelensky offered to have Ukraine become a neutral nation. But the Russian government has not accepted this termination of the supposed NATO danger as a sufficient reason to end Russia's invasion. And the Russian war effort continues to grind on ever more ferociously and destructively. The Russian government's claim that Ukraine requires denazification is particularly hollow. Like most other nations, Ukraine has fascists among its population. But unlike many other nations where fascist views are rampant and where there are large right-wing political parties and fascist elements in the government, such as in the United States and in much of Europe, right-wingers in Ukraine drew only about 2% of the vote in the last parliamentary elections, and of only one representative in the 400 or so member Ukrainian parliament, and none in Ukraine's executive branch. By contrast, Putin, ironically, has been a strong supporter of neo-fascist parties throughout Eastern and Western Europe, and they, in turn, have celebrated him. Within Ukraine, the consequences of the Russian invasion have been horrendous, including massive death and destruction, widespread war crimes against civilians, millions of refugees, and widespread suffering. Within Russia, the Putin regime has shut down what is left of independent communications media, arresting thousands of peaceful anti-war protesters, dramatically curbed civil liberties, and closed down human rights and civil liberties organizations. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Russian troops have already died in the war, and many more have been wounded. Furthermore, the Russian government's blockade of the shipment of Ukrainian grain abroad, if continued, is predicted to create massive starvation in the global south. Another consequence of the Russian invasion is the heightened militarization of Western nations. To enable Ukraine to defend itself from the Russian attack, they have poured weapons into the beleaguered country. Furthermore, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as its brazen threats of nuclear war, have sparked dramatic increases in Western military budgets. The decision of traditionally non-aligned Sweden and Finland to join NATO, and the apparent expansion of Western goals from defending Ukraine's sovereignty to weakening Russia's military power. Consequently, the prospects for a peaceful future look very bleak. Indeed, the conflict's escalation into nuclear war looks increasingly possible. Putin apparently decided to order his invasion of Ukraine under the assumption that Ukraine's ragtag armed forces were too weak to resist Russian military onslaught, and that the United States and other Western nations would limit themselves to verbal condemnations. When this proved false, and the Russian attack instead provoked a spirited and effective resistance, Putin was humiliated, and since then has redoubled Russian military efforts to eke out some kind of major victory. And as this too grows more unlikely, and the Russian armed forces are chewed up in the war, he might well turn to tactical nuclear weapons to turn the tide of battle. This historic breaking of the nuclear taboo might well result in US nuclear retaliation and a spiral upward into full-scale nuclear war. Given the fact that the Russian and US governments currently possess a total of over 11,000 nuclear weapons, that war would probably destroy most life on Earth. In these awful circumstances, why hasn't the peace movement flourished and had a significant impact on events? One reason is that the place where the peace movement could be most effective inside Russia, the nation of the military aggressor, it has been largely smashed by government repression. Despite heroic anti-war demonstrations during the early days of the war, the nationwide arrests of some 15,000 anti-war demonstrators, followed by legislation authorizing up to 15 years in prison for even mentioning peace or war. These factors have curbed overt peace activism by all but the most courageous individuals. In these unpromising circumstances, including mass media support for the war, including warnings by the security forces for suspiciously unpatriotic statements, and Putin's own public denunciation of critics of the war as what he called, quote, scum and traitors. Many Russian opponents of the war have kept a low profile. Meanwhile, an estimated 200,000 have fled abroad. Although Western peace activists have operated under much less repressive conditions, they too have been rather ineffective, largely thanks to divisions among them about what should be done in the circumstances. Many peace movement activists are reluctant to criticize Russian behavior, thanks to the long record of US military intervention in Cuba, Vietnam, Central America, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. In addition, pacifists remain uneasy about supplying weapons to Ukraine or supporting economic sanctions, while other peace activists, convinced that nations have a right to defend themselves against military invasion, are more comfortable with weapon shipments and sanctions. Moreover, even the peace movement's staunchest critics of Russian behavior fear that too sharp a condemnation of it might further inflame US public opinion and government policy toward Russia, thereby precipitating a long-term US military buildup and a disastrous escalation of the Ukraine war. But there is another division that is even deeper within the peace movement ranks. Much of the world peace movement, with an analysis of the war rather like the one I've expressed tonight, has condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops, and advocated a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. They sympathize particularly with the suffering of Ukrainian civilians and with the plight of Russian peace activists. This has been the position of the International Peace Bureau, the major worldwide association of peace organizations, and in the United States, which I know best, of the American Friends Service Committee, Peace Action, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and other peace organizations. However, US groups like the Answer Coalition, the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the US Peace Council have taken a stance aligned with the Russian government. They view the US government and NATO as the aggressors in the Ukraine conflict and blame them for the Russian invasion. Moreover, like the Russian government, they ignore Russian war crimes or claim they never occurred, insist that Nazis run Ukraine, and contend that Ukraine's government, under US tutelage, operates a vast network of biological warfare labs. These groups ignore the plight of Russian peace activists and do not express any sympathy for the sufferings of Ukraine's civilian population. In the eyes of these groups, and even of some vociferous individuals within peace organizations that are critical of the Kremlin propaganda line, the source of all evil in the world is the US government, and therefore whatever is done by a foe of the United States is somehow justified. Not surprisingly, this identification with the illegal, massively destructive Russian war effort not only promotes division and confusion within the overall peace community, but discredits the peace movement among members of the general public. Consequently, activists who consistently denounce US wars, but support a Russian war of aggression, are a gift to Russian militarists and also to US militarists. When the peace movement successfully mobilizes the American public against militarism, that mobilization is capable of restraining US militarists, as it has done on numerous occasions. But when the peace movement discredits itself by becoming a cheering squad for a foreign military aggressor, public mobilization against war is minimal and US militarists thrive. Can the movement get its act together and, despite the serious problems that it faces, become an effective force in this tragic situation? I believe that's possible. So here are some suggestions along these lines. To begin with, the peace movement needs a common analysis, one that is in line with the facts of the situation, with international law, and with the perception of most of the world's people and their nations. Very briefly, this analysis should include at least four components. First, Ukraine is an independent nation and has the same sovereign rights as any other nation, including Russia. Second, the Russian invasion of Ukraine constitutes a war of aggression. Third, the war is currently producing a disaster for the people of Ukraine, Russia, and other nations around the world. Fourth, if the war continues to escalate, it will produce an even greater disaster. The peace movement also needs common goals, a common agenda. I suggest an immediate ceasefire, the rapid withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, a United Nations brokered long-term international security agreement for Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and the reconstruction of Ukraine with economic assistance from the European Union, from Russia, from the United States, and from other nations. As it will take a considerable time to negotiate an acceptable international security agreement, including perhaps UN referenda in disputed territory, during this period, the United Nations could provide substantial forces of its own operating within Ukraine to help safeguard that nation's borders from external invasion. Stating reasonable peace movement goals is important, but appropriate tactics will be necessary to secure them. Although there are numerous possible actions toward these ends, here are some that come to mind. First, as Russian peace activists are crucial to a peace settlement, as well as the obvious allies of peace activists around the world, they should be supported vigorously. A Western peace movement defense of beleaguered Russian activists was engaged in during the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s and was often effective as publicizing abuses of the human rights of Russian activists embarrassed the Soviet government. Publicizing the activities of current Russian critics of Russia's Ukraine invasion has already been effective on occasion. Witness the minimal fine drawn by the Russian TV worker who dared to hold up an anti-war sign. This support could be shown by featuring the stories of Russian peace activists located in Russia or in exile in whatever communications media peace activists around the world can reach. By peace activists from around the world entering Russia to meet with their Russian counterparts, and by leafleting and holding joint demonstrations within Russia and elsewhere calling for end to the war. Second, why not use a peace brigade composed of peace activists and prominent personalities from around the world that, accompanied by widespread publicity, would go to Ukraine to intervene in the war directly, carrying peace banners, white flags, and perhaps UN flags. This unarmed peace brigade would march into combat zones, interposing itself between the two warring armies. It would then set up a peace camp on the battlefield, where it would call upon both sides to accept a ceasefire, invite them to participate in discussions and cultural activities at the peace camp, and explain to the troops the necessity for ending the war. Of course, in these circumstances, activists might very well be killed, wounded, or imprisoned. But soldiers, too, risk their lives, and I don't think peace activists are necessarily any less courageous. Indeed, as has been the case with other nonviolent resistance campaigns, activists might well garner sympathy and support from soldiers and from public opinion for their bravery and sacrifice. Third, the peace movement could also engage in well-publicized relief efforts for Ukrainian civilians and refugees. Food, water, medical supplies, and clothing would be particularly welcome. The American Friends Service Committee has engaged in such efforts during past wars and is once again active in these kinds of ventures. The dispatch of medical doctors would certainly be welcome. Also, of course, the provision of housing for the millions of Ukrainian refugees is essential. A thornier issue is how the US peace movement can secure some traction inside the US Congress. Its usual allies in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who in the past have championed reductions in US weapons programs and military spending, who backed the Iran nuclear agreement, and who supported a cutoff of arms sales to the Saudi government because of that government's war in Yemen, have voted for the recent $40 billion package mixing relief aid with weapons aid for Ukraine. Should the peace movement simply write off these members of Congress? I think not. They, like most of their constituents, are motivated by the belief that a nation should be able to obtain the weapons necessary to defend itself against a massive military attack by an aggressor nation. Many peace activists happen to share this view. This does not mean, though, that progressive members of Congress favor sending US or NATO troops into battle in Ukraine, or that they favor escalating the conflict into a full-scale war with Russia. Indeed, my impression is that they would back a ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops, a UN-brokered security agreement, and the reconstruction of Ukraine. Therefore, a clear peace movement agenda along these lines might well garner their support. It might well garner the support of governments in many other nations as well. Peace activists should also recognize the limits of rallying behind diplomacy as the alternative to this war. Simply talking about diplomacy as a remedy for war, as they've often done, is rather vague. Furthermore, in the context of thousands of years of self-interested, often duplicitous diplomacy among rival territories and later nations, we should recognize that diplomacy is not always productive. Governments lie, governments operate in their own self-interest very often. Although the peace movement cannot and should not outline the specific terms of a peace settlement, for, among other things, the movement lacks the right to impose terms on the victims of military aggression, it can reasonably talk about a framework for securing peace that already exists and that has been subscribed to by both Ukraine and Russia. That framework, I suggest, is the United Nations. In 1945, the United Nations was established, in the words of the preamble to its charter, to, quote, end the scourge of war. However, the leaders of the major powers of the time, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, had mixed feelings about this approach. On the one hand, they recognized that the terrible devastation of the Second World War necessitated some restrictions on the waging of war. On the other hand, they wanted to maintain their own power and influence in world affairs. Therefore, when they set up the UN Security Council to serve as the major instrument for ending war, they made themselves permanent members and gave each of themselves a veto on a Security Council action. Not surprisingly then, Security Council action for peace has often ended up being frustrated by a great power veto. But of course, remedial action could be taken to make the United Nations a more effective force for peace. With time and effort, the right of the great powers to permanent seats on the Security Council could be altered. And furthermore, the power of the veto could be diluted. Even better, though, right now, there are a number of things that the United Nations could do to circumvent the Security Council and halt the massive destruction of Ukraine. The UN Secretary General could use his office, the prerogatives of his office, to take action for peace, as Secretaries General have done on past occasions. The UN General Assembly could also take action for peace, as it has done in the past under UN General Assembly Resolution 377. That Uniting for Peace resolution provides that when there is a lack of unanimity among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly may consider the matter and issue recommendations to UN member states for collective measures to maintain or restore international peace and security. Therefore, why not demand that the United Nations play a central role in ending the war in Ukraine? Aside from the fact that the world's nations, including Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, have already agreed by signing the UN Charter to the peacemaking role of the United Nations, using the World Organization to secure peace has a number of other factors in its favor. For one thing, Russian officials would be very reluctant to accept a peace without victory on their part if that peace were demanded by its foes in this war, notably Ukraine, the United States, and other NATO nations. But the United Nations is not a direct party to the Ukraine war, and as an outsider, provides an off-ramp for Russia and the other warring nations. Furthermore, as the agreed upon voice of the world community, the United Nations has enormous credibility. Even China, a nation that verbally aligned itself with Russia before the war began, very shortly before the war began, has considerable respect for the United Nations, for its charter, and for a framework of international law. This was certainly one reason that China did not support the Russian position at the United Nations. It is also the reason that the United Nations managed to broker agreements for safe passage of Ukrainian civilians from war zones, and is now closely involved in efforts to arrange for the massive shipment of Ukrainian grain to food-deprived countries. Finally, if the world survives this war, we can still expect other wars in the future. Therefore, if the United Nations brokered a settlement to the Ukraine war, that would strengthen the world organization as a force for peace in future conflicts. For this reason, it seems to me that at the governmental level on the world scene, the peace movement's natural ally in bringing an end to this terrible war is not the US government or the Russian government, but the United Nations. Consequently, the peace movement should be emphasizing the vital role of the World Organization, applauding its actions for peace, and working with it at every turn. So I do think that there are a number of things that the peace movement can do to help bring the war in Ukraine to an end. There are other ways, of course, the war could end. For example, Ukraine could simply surrender to the Russian military invaders, suffer the grim consequences of Russian military occupation, accept the destruction of Ukraine's cultural and political independence, and become part of the Russian Empire. The Putin regime might then turn to invading other small, weak countries on its borders, claiming that somehow they also threaten it. But if you think Vietnam has a right to independence from imperial domination, that Algeria has a right to independence from imperial domination, and that Cuba has a right to independence from imperial domination, then you probably think that Ukraine does too. And in that case, you'll probably find Ukraine's surrender to Russian military invasion and imperial subjugation rather unappealing. Alternatively, the war could come to an end after it escalates into a US-Russian war of such vast destructiveness that there wouldn't be much left of Ukraine or the world to occupy. About all that would be left would be a charred radioactive wasteland. That prospect too, I suspect, would be rather unappealing. By contrast, a peace movement campaign to stop the fighting, send the Russians home, use the United Nations to broker a long-term international security agreement, and reconstruct Ukraine could produce a much different outcome, one far brighter, more just, and more consonant with the peace movement's professed ideals. Of course, that kind of campaign calls for some clarity about the realities of the conflict, as well as lots of daring, creativity, and efforts by the peace movement. All in all, the task that lies before it is daunting. But that also means that the victory, the real victory of producing an alternative to war, would be even sweeter. Thank you. I'll be glad to take some questions now. I believe the chat should be open and you can start writing them in. And I believe in that short period of time you're writing them in, or you start writing them in, Janine Moon will be asking me the first question.
Larry, I have to say, if we were in person, when you said that line, if you think Vietnam deserves independence and if you think Cuba deserves independence, I think you would have heard a round of applause. That was a really powerful moment. For me, I know I got goosebumps, so thank you for that moment. So I do have a question that I wanted to ask you while everybody is getting their thoughts together. Is there a difference between how small, militarily weak countries view the United Nations and how militarily powerful countries view the World Organization?
Yes, definitely. Historically, of course, it's been large, powerful nations that have invaded small, weaker ones, and small, weaker ones, therefore, needed some kind of defense. Now, sometimes they would turn to one of the other powerful countries. They would join some kind of alliance system. But the United Nations, the weaker nations realized fairly quickly, was another way that they could be defended against invasion by one of the great powers, one of the traditional imperial powers. And therefore, over the decades, the smaller nations have been much, much friendlier to the United Nations than the great powers have been. And the great powers are always worried that they're going to be outvoted in the General Assembly and they're going to be forced back from their invasion of Vietnam or of Ukraine or of some other place. They feel they have a perfect right to take over. So that, yes, the weaker nations sometimes turn to alliances, sometimes turn to the United Nations. And for that reason, of course, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons has been backed by the world's smaller nations. And of course, the nuclear armed powers, which are usually the most powerful nuclear nations or most powerful military nations, not a single one of them backs that UN treaty. So, other questions from the chat?
Fred asked an excellent question, and I'm going to jump to his because that's a really good question, Fred. Can United Nations troops be deployed to protect the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, as a breach of these plants could contaminate European nations?
Absolutely, they could. The United Nations merely has to vote for that sort of thing. And indeed, there are peacekeeping missions and peacemaking missions that the United Nations has engaged in for decades now. The United States is one of the few countries that does not contribute to these UN peacekeeping forces, but they're the so-called blue helmets that go into conflict zones and try to separate the contending parties and serve as a buffer. So they could certainly be dispatched by the UN to Ukraine along those lines. And given the immense dangers of those nuclear power plants burning to the ground, being bombed, whatever, and contaminating the world with deadly radioactivity, I think that would be a very useful thing indeed.
I think Ted knows that you're a former history professor, because you're gonna have to put your history professor hat on for this one.
Okay.
Can you compare and contrast the current situation with the situation in Europe in the 1930s, where the memory of the horrors of World War I competed with the reality of the fascists' advances in Spain and with countries being taken over by Germany? Are there some lessons there?
Yes, I believe there are. The First World War was a nightmare in many ways. It was the first war on a worldwide basis with the highest, with huge casualties. And after the war, there was an immense feeling of war weariness and a turning away from warfare. Peace groups flourished in the United States and elsewhere. The League of Nations was set up as an attempt to avert future war. However, as fascist aggression grew in the 1930s, as fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and fascist Japan drew together into an alliance, as German troops were on the march in Europe and Italian troops in Africa, Japanese troops in China. Many of those former peace activists went over to what was then increasingly called collective security. That is, their view was that the non-fascist nations had to stand together to stop fascism. And a good part of the left, which had turned against war too, thanks to the First World War, set up the Popular Front and went off to fight in Spain to resist fascism there from 1936 to 1939. So the peace movement didn't totally collapse, but it lost much of its strength as a good deal of its constituency went over to collective security.
Dennis has asked, what role did US foreign policy, quote unquote, regime change play in the 2014 coup d'etat in Ukraine, and what is the significance of its ensuing 8-year civil war?
Well, all right, that's a big question. Let me just grab a couple of notes here I have, since they help me remember some of the names that involved. Russia had for many years had a stake in Ukraine for many hundreds of years, although Ukraine was also ruled by other countries, including Austria-Hungary and Poland and so on. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukrainians were given the right to a poll on independence or staying with Russia in a commonwealth of states, Gorbachev, who was still head of what was left of the Soviet Union at that time, authorized a plebiscite there. And the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, I think it was 93%, voted for independence. However, Russia, of course, in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its independence. However, the Russian government, or nationalist elements in the Russian government, looked back fondly to the great days when Russia ruled Ukraine and weren't so pleased about that independence. And when Vladimir Putin and his cohort came to power, they sought to hold on to a close relationship, at the very least, with independent Ukraine. Then, when the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, well, he had started out dealing with the European Union, since the Ukrainian parliament wanted some sort of trade deal at that point. It was an independent nation, after all. They could deal with whom they pleased. The Russian government was very upset about that, felt they should continue their trading relationship with Russia. Yanukovych thereupon scrapped the plan to deal with the EU and instead turned to Russia for the trade deal. There were massive demonstrations that followed by Ukrainians. Yanukovych government ordered out the security forces. They opened fire on the demonstrators for months. This took place in 2013, 2014. Hundreds were killed. Finally, Yanukovych fled to Russia. The Ukrainian parliament voted to oust him. The Russians viewed this as a coup. The Ukrainians view this as a revolution of dignity. But some Ukrainians didn't, those in the eastern sliver of the country, who were either pro-Russian or Russian-speaking. And the Russians then moved in. They seized Crimea. They brought in Russian troops and troops from one of their mercenary groups, the Wagner Group, to help the separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine. And from that point on, Russia was involved in Ukraine as such, and indeed annexed Crimea and made it part of Russia. That was the largest landed transfer since the end of the Second World War that took place in Europe.
Tad Daly of Citizens for Global Solution has a follow-up to the question that you just asked. And it's about the change of government in Kiev in 2014. His understanding is that one of the first things that the new government did was suggest that the Russian naval base in Sevastopol might be transformed into a NATO naval position. Is that relevant? It seems to him that while that does not justify the 2022 invasions, it adds to the case that NATO provoked the invasion and spent 30 years intentionally trying to diminish Russia's national security.
Well, whatever the Ukrainian government thought or wanted, or the US government thought or wanted, there was very serious opposition within NATO to Ukraine's accession to that alliance, particularly from Germany and France, that are two very significant nations, the most powerful nations on the European continent within NATO. So when they said no, in fact, it meant no. and Ukraine didn't join NATO, and it is still not joined NATO, and NATO is not fighting for it, and NATO never, for that matter, ever fought Russia in its years of existence since 1949. So I think, while the Russian government was, of course, not pleased by any possibility of any alliance being closer to it than in the past, the fact was that the Russian government had little to fear from Ukraine joining, or if Ukraine somehow had joined, which it didn't, then it wouldn't have been such a horrifying thing.
Kevin asked a question that I find myself debating with people frequently, so I'm very curious to hear your take on it. In addition to understandable concern and solidarity with the people of Ukraine, I fear there is an unexamined, naive, and/or arrogant reliance on US military superiority to maintain escalation dominance. How can we sound the alarm that we absolutely cannot rely on that to avert calamity?
Well, I think, as I pointed out in my talk, that's a real danger. Escalation is a real danger. And there are certainly militarists in the United States who would welcome escalating the Ukraine war, who have backed a no-fly zone in that country, who would back a conventional war against Russia, who, if it came to it, would back a nuclear war against Russia, and so on, just as there are militarist counterparts in Russia. So the question is how to avoid bolstering their power. And I think that finding a peace settlement short of escalation is the best way to do that. I don't think that, fortunately, the Biden administration thus far has rejected a no-fly zone, has rejected a direct clash with Russian planes or troops, has rejected nuclear war. Occasionally his real feelings slip out, but Biden's a very tactless fellow, and the State Department and Biden too immediately follow his tactless statements with disavowals of that being escalation being US policy. He says it's not, and it hasn't been so far. I think, though, that the real goal now should be to see to it that there's some kind of settlement that's neither Ukrainian surrender or escalation to full-scale horrible war.
Both Diana Hernandez and Leo Levy have brought up nuclear war. So I'm going to combine the two questions. What are the chances of starting a nuclear war with Russia over this conflict? And what would China's role be? Because if nuclear weapons are used in Ukraine, it's not just going to affect the Ukraine, it's going to affect a lot of their neighbors. So why isn't there more talk about it?
Well, there may be in secret meetings or conversations. I'm not sure what sort of green light the Chinese government gave Putin when he went there shortly before launching the invasion. They may have told him, keep this limited, don't go beyond this, and so on. Don't get us involved in a full-scale war, certainly not a nuclear war. Or they may not have discussed that, but they may be telling him that now. I would think that the Chinese government would have a good deal to gain by settling things as soon as possible in Ukraine. That is, I would think that China wouldn't want, the Chinese government wouldn't want things to get out of hand. Were I in the Chinese Communist Party, a leader in it and so on, I'd be telling Xi Jinping that, just play it cool now, try to rein the Russians in. Let's see whether some sort of settlement could be reached, and so on. In fact, Xi would get a lot of credit with the U.S. government if he pulled something like that off, if he did manage to help broker an agreement. I think the major reason he doesn't is that Russia or Putin in that visit to China said, well, we're going to stand by you, so we assume you'll stand by us. So Xi might have said, well, yes, of course, but don't go too far. I think that the Chinese government doesn't want the war to get out of hand, doesn't want the West to triumph over Russia, would like some kind of settlement, so China could come out of this without a disaster for its own foreign policy.
Susan has asked, if UN peacekeeping forces were to be stationed in Ukraine, what countries might provide the personnel? It seems like troops from NATO nations or ones from Russia's alliance would not be candidates. Same question for naval escorts for grain ships.
That might well take place. I should note that while the United States has always resisted providing U.S. troops under NATO command, Canada has been very eager to supply troops and has often supplied troops for the United Nations. But of course, they don't have to be used. There are many other countries that supply UN troops. These are often trained combat troops that have served in their own country's armed forces and are then given to the United Nations. And the United Nations then takes command of them, and they answer to UN commanders. So, and they have to swear allegiance to this UN command. They have to be like the United Nations, not simply a tool of any one nation or a small group of nations.
We've gotten quite a few people asking your personal opinion, so I'm going to consolidate multiple questions. Do you believe that political pressure and the United Nations and activists can compel Putin to withdraw from Russia?
From Ukraine.
From Ukraine, yeah, sorry.
I doubt from Russia.
Yeah, probably not from Russia.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Yeah. Well, I think that's possible. How likely it is, I don't know. Wars do end, generally speaking, although I guess Israel's war with the Palestinians might lead us to question that. But and wars do generally end. So the only question is, when do they end? I think it could end with sufficient peace movement pressure combined with UN pressure, combined with the embarrassment of many nations caused by peace movements within their own countries and by UN pressure on them when the UN would call, the General Assembly would call on the nations to do X, Y, and Z and fall into line on that score.
So Mark wants to push you a little bit further on your answer. So blame him for this one. Can negotiations reach agreement when Russia and Ukraine both insist on controlling the Donbass? Could a referendum after foreign troops withdraw be a possible solution?
Well, It could be one, yes, yes. I think that, how can I put it? The Donbass, which is the easternmost region of Ukraine, is certainly in dispute, both militarily and in terms of who's going to run it in the future. The Putin government, just before sending in troops to invade, recognized the independence of the Luhansk and Donetsk provinces. In a way, Russia's already said, well, they're not Ukraine anymore, and we're going to support them. Previously, of course, in the Minsk agreement, the Russians said that they were willing to have those regions in a sort of a semi-autonomous status within Ukraine, not as independent republics as they later claimed after or when they invaded. So the Russian stance isn't clear. They might be willing to go for a referendum if they felt they could win it. They supposedly held referenda, but of course they were in charge of things in the past. They held one in Crimea that they won, but Crimea was occupied by Russian troops. So that's hardly an impartial way to hold a referendum. So if the UN was in charge of referenda in these regions, or in portions of these regions, perhaps, then I think that would make it more acceptable, both to Russia and to Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has said that it is willing to accept neutrality, no NATO status, with the issue of the Donbass to be left for negotiations.
So this is not a question. This is a statement, but I think it is an incredible way to end this evening, and it comes from Jim. June 12th, 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the largest peace demonstration in United States history. On this historic day, 1 million people marched from the United Nations, filled the streets of New York City, and rallied in Central Park to demand an end to the nuclear arms race. I think we can absolutely make something like that happen again to help push to the end of the war to Ukraine. And I can't think of a better statement or comment to end tonight's discussion. So I want to thank you very much, Larry, for your wonderful talk and for taking all of these incredible questions. I know they were very difficult questions. I couldn't have answered them myself, so I thank you for that. And we're going to put in the chat information about Upper Hudson Peace Action. So if you like the lecture you heard tonight, we do have other ones available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. So feel free to hop on that and like us. We also have a website, and if you are so inclined to do so and you would like to donate to Upper Hudson Peace Action, we will put the address that you can mail a check to. That information is also available on our website. So Larry, did you have any end comments that you'd like to say?
Sure. The June 12th, 1982 demonstration was historic, and I was there, as a matter of fact. But of course, there were anti-nuclear demonstrations taking place around the world at that time. So it's vital not only to have a strong peace movement in the United States, but also to have a strong global peace movement in Russia, in Japan, in Germany, and nations around the world. And I hope that the participants in tonight's meeting will take that to heart and will work to do their part in building the world's peace movement. It's what really stands between us and not only wars like the Ukraine war, but nuclear war. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're getting wonderful comments and thank yous and beautiful things in the chat about how everybody loves you. And you did a great job.
Bye now.
Yeah, thank you.